"Ma'am, you are not on the list. You need to leave right now." The voice cut through the soft hum of the auction room, sharp enough to turn heads but controlled enough to sound official. And Ava Carter did not move. Not immediately. She stood at the center of polished marble floors under a chandelier that reflected light across rows of million-dollar art pieces, her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence quiet but unshaken as if the command had not fully reached her yet. And, around her, conversation slowed, subtle glances exchanged between guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, each one trying to understand why a woman who carried herself with such composed authority was being singled out in a room built for exclusivity. And the man who had spoken, a security supervisor in a crisp black suit, stepped closer, his tone lowering but his intent firm, repeating the instruction with the kind of certainty that came from believing he was protecting the integrity of the event. And Ava's eyes shifted slightly, not toward him, but across the room, taking in the layout, the bidders seated with numbered paddles, the staff positioned near each display, the silent rhythm of high-stakes transactions unfolding in the background. And then she looked back at him, her voice steady, almost quiet. "There must be a mistake," she said, not defensive, not confrontational, simply precise. And that precision did something unexpected. It did not escalate the moment. It slowed it, forcing it to exist longer than it was supposed to. And from the far end of the room, Richard Holloway, the auction director, noticed the disruption, his gaze narrowing slightly as he moved forward with controlled urgency, his presence carrying authority that parted the crowd without effort. And when he reached her, he did not hesitate, his tone polite but edged with something colder, something practiced. "This is a private auction," he said, his words measured, deliberate, designed to sound reasonable while reinforcing a boundary that had already been drawn. And Ava met his gaze without flinching, her expression unchanged, as if she were listening not just to his words, but to the assumptions behind them. And the silence that followed stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable, just long enough to turn curiosity into attention. And Richard continued, slightly louder now, aware of the audience forming around them. "If you are not registered, you cannot remain here." And that was the moment the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a subtle tightening of focus, the kind that happens when a situation begins to carry more meaning than it first appeared. And Ava did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there for one more second, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering, before she nodded once, a small, controlled motion that revealed nothing and yet suggested everything. And as the security stepped closer to escort her out, the room watched, not because of the removal itself, but because something about it did not feel complete, as if the moment had started in the wrong place and had not yet reached where it was supposed to go. And Ava turned without resistance, walking toward the exit with the same measured pace she had entered, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her posture unchanged, her silence louder than any protest could have been. And just before she crossed the threshold, she paused for the briefest moment, her eyes moving once more across the room, not searching, not questioning, but observing, as if memorizing something that the rest of them had not yet realized would matter. And then she stepped out, leaving behind a space that felt different than before, quieter, heavier, as if something important had just been removed too early, and no one in that room could yet explain why. Outside the auction hall, the heavy doors closed with a soft finality that felt louder than it should have, sealing off the murmurs, the bids, the carefully curated world that had just decided she did not belong. And Ava Carter stood there for a moment in the quiet corridor lined with framed certificates and discreet security cameras, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if nothing significant had just happened. And the guard who had escorted her lingered for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting some kind of reaction, an argument, frustration, something that would justify the decision that had just been made. But Ava gave him nothing, no anger, no resistance, only a calm presence that made the moment feel incomplete, like a sentence that had been cut off before it reached its meaning. And when he finally turned and walked back inside, the silence settled around her completely, uninterrupted, almost deliberate, and Ava exhaled slowly, not out of defeat, but out of clarity, as if the situation had simply confirmed something she had already understood before she ever walked in, and she reached into her bag with measured precision, pulling out her phone, her movements unhurried, her focus absolute. And as the screen lit up, her reflection caught briefly in the glass panel beside her, composed, centered, unaffected, and she dialed a number without hesitation, bringing the phone to her ear, her gaze lifting slightly as she listened. And when the line connected, she did not introduce herself. She did not explain. Her voice was quiet, controlled, carrying a certainty that did not require context. "Proceed," she said. And that single word held weight, not because of its volume, but because of its intention. And then she ended the call just as simply as she had made it. No follow-up, no elaboration, just action. And for a brief moment, nothing seemed to change. The hallway remained still, the distant sounds of the auction continuing behind the doors, the illusion of normalcy intact. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, something that would not announce itself immediately, something that would move. Through systems, through decisions, through layers of authority that the people inside that room believed they controlled. And Ava slipped the phone back into her bag, her posture straightening slightly, not in reaction, but in readiness, and she turned her attention back toward the closed doors, not with urgency, not with impatience, but with quiet certainty, as if she already knew that what had just been set in motion would not take long to reach them. And inside, the auction continued, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm, bidders raising paddles in controlled increments, unaware that the foundation beneath their transactions had already begun to shift. And Ava remained exactly where she was, composed, still, her presence now outside the room, but not removed from it, because what she had initiated did not require her to be seen to be effective. And as the seconds passed, the corridor seemed to hold its breath, not because anything visible had happened, but because something inevitable was already on its way, moving quietly toward a moment that would not be ignored. And Ava did not move to follow it. She did not need to, because power, when it is real, does not chase outcomes. It sets them in motion and waits. Inside the auction hall, nothing appeared different at first. The auctioneer's voice continued its measured rhythm, numbers rising in steady increments as bidders lifted their paddles with controlled confidence. The atmosphere still wrapped in polished exclusivity, but beneath that surface, something subtle had begun to shift, something that did not announce itself with noise, only with disruption. And Richard Holloway stood near the front, his attention returning to the flow of the event, his posture composed, his earlier interaction already being dismissed as a minor interruption, the kind that happens when boundaries are enforced. But as the next lot was introduced, a rare sculpture expected to draw aggressive bidding, the assistant at his side leaned in slightly, her expression tightened, her voice low but urgent. "There is a delay in the system," she said, and Richard's eyes narrowed just slightly, not alarmed, but irritated, as if inconvenience itself were unacceptable in a space designed for perfection. "Resolve it." He replied quietly, his tone controlled, but the assistant did not move away, her hesitation signaling that this was not a simple issue. And across the room, one of the digital display boards flickered briefly before stabilizing, the numbers resetting for a fraction of a second before, returning, subtle enough that most guests would not notice, but not subtle enough to go completely unseen. And a few of the more experienced bidders lowered their paddles, glancing toward the staff with faint curiosity, sensing a break in the precision they expected. And Richard stepped closer to the control console, his gaze scanning the interface, his fingers moving quickly as he checked the bidder registry, the transactions, the ownership allocations, and for a moment, everything appeared intact, until it did not, until a single line of data caught his attention, unfamiliar, out of place, not because it was incorrect, but because it had not been there before. And he leaned in slightly, his focus sharpening, reading it again, confirming what he was seeing, and the calm certainty he had carried began to thin, replaced by something more cautious, more deliberate, as if the ground beneath the event had shifted without permission. And the assistant spoke again, quieter this time. "There has been a change in primary bidder status," she said, and that sentence landed differently, not as an error, but as a fact, and facts in a system like this do not appear without cause. And Richard straightened, his gaze moving across the room instinctively, searching for something he could not yet define, and around him, the auction slowed, not halted, but no longer seamless. The rhythm disrupted just enough to be felt, the bidders waiting rather than reacting, the auctioneer pausing for a fraction longer between calls, his practiced cadence adjusting to something unseen, and in that moment, Richard felt it clearly for the first time, the realization that the interruption earlier had not ended when the doors closed. It had simply moved, shifting from a visible confrontation into something far more precise, something embedded within the structure of the event itself. And as he looked back at the screen, the name attached to the updated status remained there, steady, undeniable, not flickering, not uncertain, just present, and the presence of it changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because it meant that what had been dismissed as a mistake was now something else entirely, something that could not be escorted out, something that had already positioned itself at the center of the system. And as the room held its quiet tension, the realization settled in with a clarity that could not be avoided. The moment outside had not been the end, it had been the beginning, and whatever had just been set in motion was now inside, woven into the auction itself, moving forward without needing permission, without needing acknowledgement, only requiring time to reveal what it had already become. The shift did not announce itself loudly. It tightened, almost invisibly, as the auctioneer paused mid-sentence just long enough for the room to notice that something was no longer moving with its usual precision, and Richard Holloway felt it before anyone spoke it, that subtle disruption that spreads through a system when control begins to slip, and he stepped closer to the console again, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the updated bidder hierarchy, and this time there was no uncertainty in what he saw. The primary position had changed, reassigned not through manual input, but through authorization from a higher tier, a level that did not require his approval, and that realization settled in slowly, not as panic, but as pressure, the kind that builds when the structure you trust begins to shift without warning. And beside him, the assistant kept her voice low, steady. "The ownership credentials are verified," she said, and the words carried a weight that removed any possibility of error, because verification in this system was not casual, it was absolute. And across the room, a few bidders exchanged glances, subtle but deliberate, their instincts picking up on the change even if they did not yet understand it, while the auctioneer adjusted his stance, clearing his throat softly, waiting for confirmation to proceed. And that pause stretched just long enough to break the illusion of seamless control, and Richard straightened, his posture tightening, his gaze lifting instinctively toward the entrance, as if drawn by something he had not yet fully processed. And in that moment, the earlier interaction returned to him, not as a memory, but as a miscalculation. Something he had dismissed too quickly, something that had not ended when the doors closed, and the connection formed with quiet clarity, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable, and he turned back to the screen, his focus sharpening as he traced the authorization path, each layer confirming the same conclusion, that the change had not been random, it had been initiated, deliberate, precise, and entirely beyond his control. And the assistant spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost careful. "The new primary bidder has exclusive acquisition rights," she said, and that sentence altered the entire structure of the event, because it meant that the flow of bidding, the competition, the control he had maintained over the room, all of it could be overridden, redirected, claimed. And the realization settled into the space with a quiet finality, and Richard exhaled slowly, not out of calm, but out of recalibration, as if adjusting to a reality that no longer aligned with his expectations. And around him, the room held its tension, the guests waiting, not impatient, but aware that something had shifted, something important, something that would soon define the direction of everything that followed. And Richard looked once more toward the entrance, his expression tightening just slightly, because now the absence of the woman who had been escorted out no longer felt like resolution. It felt like a gap, a missing piece in a system that had just revealed a new center, and that center was not inside the room, at least not yet, but it was connected, directly, undeniably. And as the seconds passed, the weight of that connection grew, not through noise, not through announcement, but through the quiet certainty that whatever had just taken control would not remain unseen for long. And for the first time since the auction began, Richard was no longer managing the moment. He was waiting for it to arrive. The room did not return to its original rhythm. It hovered in a suspended state, as if every person present sensed that something had shifted beyond their control, but could not yet name it. And Richard Holloway remained near the console, his posture upright, but no longer relaxed. His attention divided between the system in front of him and the growing awareness that the event was no longer unfolding under his direction. And across the polished floor, the auctioneer adjusted his stance again, glancing toward Richard with a subtle question in his eyes, waiting for a signal that did not come immediately. And that hesitation spread, small but undeniable, through the room, as bidders lowered their paddles and leaned back slightly, their confidence replaced with observation, their instincts telling them that something unseen had taken precedence. And beside Richard, the assistant kept her voice low, steady. Authorization came from a controlling entity, she said, and the phrasing itself carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, because in a system like this, control was not granted casually. It was structured, layered, protected, and for it to shift without notice meant that someone with greater authority had already acted. And Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation, as he traced the chain of command in his mind, the ownership layers, the private holdings behind the auction. And for the first time, a name began to form, not yet confirmed, but increasingly difficult to ignore, and he turned his gaze once more toward the entrance. The memory of the woman he had dismissed now no longer separate from the disruption unfolding in front of him, but directly connected to it, and that connection settled into place with a quiet inevitability, not explosive, not sudden, but precise, like a final piece aligning in a structure that had been incomplete. And he stepped away from the console, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if shifting from one role to another without fully acknowledging it, and he signaled to a staff member. Near the entrance, his voice low but urgent. "Find her," he said, and the instruction carried a different tone now, not authority enforcing exclusion, but authority recognizing absence. And the staff member moved quickly, not questioning, not hesitating, because the shift in Richard's voice was enough to signal that the situation had changed. And across the room, the guests watched this new movement with heightened attention, the subtle urgency, the redirected focus, all pointing towards something that had not yet been revealed but was clearly approaching. And the assistant remained at the console, her eyes fixed on the system as new confirmations continued to appear, each one reinforcing the same reality, that control had already been transferred, that the event was no longer proceeding under its original structure, and that whatever had been set in motion outside those doors was now fully embedded within the auction itself. And Richard paused for a brief moment, his gaze steady, his breathing measured, as he absorbed the weight of what he now understood, not completely, but enough to know that the moment he thought he had ended had only just begun. And as the doors at the far end of the hall remained closed, the space between anticipation and revelation grew thinner, tighter, holding the room in a quiet tension that could not be ignored, because something was coming back, not to rejoin the event, but to redefine it entirely. The doors at the far end of the hall remained closed, but the room no longer felt contained. It felt like it was waiting, suspended in a quiet anticipation that had replaced the earlier confidence. And Richard Holloway stood near the center now, no longer anchored to the console. His position subtly shifted from control to awareness, his gaze fixed on the entrance, as if expecting something that had already begun to unfold beyond his reach. And the staff he had sent had not yet returned. But the delay itself carried meaning, because in a space where everything moved with precision, hesitation was not accidental. It was a signal, and across the room, the guests had fully transitioned from participants to observers, their posture relaxed but their attention sharpened, their instincts recognizing that the event they had come for was no longer just about the collection, but about something else entirely, something unfolding in real time. And near the back of the room, one of the senior coordinators moved quickly toward Richard, his expression composed but urgent, his voice low enough to remain private. "There has been confirmation from corporate," he said, and the phrasing alone shifted the weight of the moment. because corporate did not intervene without reason, and Richard's expression tightened slightly, not with resistance, but with recognition, as if the final layer of uncertainty had just been removed, and he nodded once. A controlled motion that acknowledged the information without yet revealing its full impact, and the coordinator continued. The controlling entity has executed a full acquisition directive, and that sentence settled into the space with quiet finality, because it did not describe a possibility. It described a completed action, something that had already taken effect, and the implications moved quickly through Richard's mind. The structure of the auction, the ownership of the collection, the authority behind the event itself. All of it now connected to a single source that had acted without his involvement, and as that realization took hold, the earlier moment at the entrance returned again, not as a disruption, but as a misjudgment, one that had now expanded into something far larger than he had anticipated, and he turned his gaze once more toward the doors, his posture straightening, not in authority, but in preparation, as if aligning himself with a reality that was about to become visible to everyone else. And the coordinator stepped back slightly, his role complete, leaving Richard standing in a space that no longer belonged to him in the same way. And across the room, the auctioneer lowered his gavel, not striking it, but holding it mid-air, waiting for a signal that had not yet come, and that pause extended, stretching the moment just enough to make it undeniable that the flow had been interrupted by something beyond the ordinary. And then, with a soft but distinct sound, the doors began to open, not abruptly, but with deliberate control, and every eye in the room shifted toward that movement, drawn by the quiet certainty that whatever was about to enter would not simply rejoin the event, it would redefine it, and Richard did not move to meet it. He did not step forward or call out. He remained exactly where he was, his expression composed but no longer certain, because now, more than anything else, he was waiting, not to act, but to understand the full weight of what he had already set in motion without realizing it. The doors opened with a measured slowness that drew every eye in the room without a single word being spoken, and for a brief moment, no one moved, as if the entire space had aligned itself toward that single point of entry. And then Ava Carter stepped inside, her presence unchanged from before, composed, steady, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that did not seek attention yet commanded it completely. And the difference this time was not in her. It was in the room, because now every movement around her adjusted without instruction, staff stepping slightly aside, conversations falling silent, the subtle choreography of authority rearranging itself in real time. And Richard Holloway watched from where he stood, his gaze fixed, his earlier certainty replaced with a focused stillness, as if he were recalculating every assumption he had made only minutes ago. And Ava did not rush. She did not acknowledge the shift openly. She simply walked forward with the same measured pace, her heels marking a quiet rhythm against the polished floor, each step reinforcing a presence that no longer needed to be questioned. And as she moved further into the room, the auctioneer lowered his gavel completely, not striking it, but holding it at his side, waiting, because the event itself had now adjusted to her arrival without needing to be told. And the assistant near the console glanced toward Richard, then back to the system, as if confirming what was already known, and the confirmation did not change. It remained steady, consistent, undeniable, and Ava's gaze moved briefly across the displays, the artwork, the bidders, not with curiosity, but with familiarity, as if she had already considered each piece long before stepping into the room. And that subtle detail shifted the perception of her presence even further, because it suggested not participation, but ownership, not interest, but intent. And when she finally came to a stop, it was not at the entrance, not at the edge, but near the center of the room, exactly where attention naturally converged. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to make the shift unmistakable. And Richard took a step forward, not out of authority, but out of necessity, his posture controlled, his expression composed but no longer certain. And when he spoke, his voice was measured, quieter than before, carrying a different tone, one shaped by recognition rather than assumption. "Ma'am," he began, and the single word held more weight now than anything he had said earlier, because it acknowledged something that had not been acknowledged before, and Ava turned her gaze toward him, steady, unhurried, meeting his eyes without tension, without reaction, simply present, and that presence alone was enough to confirm what the system had already revealed, what the room had already begun to understand, that the balance of power had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far more precise, something that had already been set in motion long before this moment. And as the room remained still, watching, waiting, the reality settled in quietly but fully, that the woman who had been escorted out was now the defining force within the room. And everything that followed would move according to that truth. The silence held just long enough to transform into something heavier, something undeniable, as Ava Carter stood at the center of the room and did not rush to fill it, did not move to explain, did not offer anything that would reduce the weight of the moment, and Richard Holloway remained a few steps away, his posture controlled but no longer anchored in authority, his voice having already shifted once, now waiting, not to assert, but to understand, and Ava's gaze rested on him for a brief second longer before she turned slightly, her attention moving toward the auctioneer, toward the space where the event itself had paused, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of what had come before. "You may continue," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more authority than any declaration could have. Because it did not request, it permitted, and that distinction settled instantly into the structure of the room, reshaping it without resistance. And the auctioneer nodded almost immediately, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, his posture adjusting as he raised the gavel again, the rhythm returning not to what it had been, but to something more aligned, more precise, as if the event had corrected itself around a new center, and Richard watched this shift in real time, his gaze moving from Ava to the auctioneer to the staff, each element of the room now responding to her presence without hesitation, and the realization completed itself quietly, fully, that the authority he had assumed was now secondary, repositioned, and as the bidding resumed, the system updated seamlessly. The primary bidder status no longer an anomaly but the defining structure of the event, and Ava stood without moving closer, without raising a paddle, without signaling interest, because she did not need to participate in the way others did, her position already established beyond the visible mechanics of the auction, and one by one, the lots were presented, the bids called, but the dynamic had changed, the competition softened, the urgency reduced, as if the room itself understood that the outcome was no longer uncertain, that the presence at the center had already determined the direction, and the assistant near the console glanced once more at the system, confirming what had become clear: the acquisition path aligned entirely with a single entity, one that did not need to announce itself because it was already embedded at every level. And Richard took a slow breath, his expression composed but quieter now, his earlier certainty replaced with a measured awareness that did not seek to challenge what had been revealed. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to correct, not to defend, but simply to acknowledge. "Everything is prepared for your acquisition," he said, his tone steady, respectful, and Ava inclined her head slightly, a small, controlled motion that accepted the statement without amplifying it, without drawing attention to it, because the moment did not require emphasis. It was already complete, and around them, the room continued, the auction moving forward under a structure that had been quietly redefined, not through conflict, not through confrontation, but through the precise alignment of authority and reality. And as the final pieces were presented, the outcome no longer felt like a result of bidding, but of inevitability, something that had been decided long before anyone in that room had recognized it. And Ava remained exactly where she was, composed, still, her presence the constant around which everything else adjusted. And in that stillness, the truth of the moment settled fully into place, that what had begun as exclusion had ended in complete control, not declared, not demanded, but simply revealed. The final lot concluded without resistance, without the usual tension that defined moments of high-value competition, and as the auctioneer lowered the gavel with a controlled finality, the sound echoed softly through the room, not as a climax, but as confirmation of something that had already been decided, and Ava Carter remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome required no reaction, no acknowledgement beyond her presence itself. And around her, the room began to settle, not returning to what it had been before, but adjusting to a new understanding that lingered quietly in every movement, every glance, every unspoken realization. And Richard Holloway stood a few steps behind her now, not positioned as the center, not directing the moment, but aligned slightly to the side. His posture still composed, his expression controlled, but his role unmistakably altered. And for a brief moment, he looked at her, not with confusion, not with resistance, but with a recognition that carried more weight than any apology could have, because it acknowledged the shift without attempting to undo it. And Ava did not turn to meet that gaze immediately. She allowed the silence to hold, allowed the room to settle fully into what had just occurred. And when she finally moved, it was not dramatic, not deliberate in a way that drew attention. She simply stepped forward toward the display where the collection had been presented, her movements measured, precise, as if completing a process rather than claiming a victory. And the staff responded instantly, not through instruction, but through understanding, adjusting their positions, preparing the necessary documents, aligning themselves with the authority that had already been established. And the assistant approached with a tablet, her voice quiet, respectful. "Everything is finalized," she said, and Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without expanding it, because there was nothing left to define, nothing left to prove. The moment had already resolved itself completely. And as she reached out to confirm the acquisition, her gesture was simple, controlled, absent of any display, reinforcing the same truth that had carried through every moment before, that power does not need to be performed to be recognized. And behind her, Richard remained still for a second longer before stepping back fully, creating space not out of obligation, but out of alignment, as if recognizing that the structure of the room had permanently shifted, and that his place within it had been redefined accordingly. And across the room, the guests began to move again, quietly, their conversations returning in low tones, not dismissing what had happened, but absorbing it, integrating it into their understanding of the space they occupied. And Ava turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room one final time, not searching, not questioning, simply observing with a clarity that required no reinforcement. And then she began to walk, her steps steady, her presence unchanged from the moment she first entered, because nothing about her had needed to change, only the perception around her had shifted. And as she moved toward the exit, the path cleared naturally, not forced, not directed, simply understood. And the doors opened once more, this time without interruption, without hesitation. And as she stepped through, the room remained behind her, quieter, more aware, permanently altered in a way that did not need to be spoken, because once recognition takes hold, it does not fade. It remains, shaping every moment that follows with a quiet certainty that cannot be undone.